Yeah. So should we get started?
I think people are coming, and now Professor Sudhir, so nice of you coming to the NITIE platforms, and from core of our heart, we extend our warm welcome to you, sir, and hope that everyone with you and family have a nice time in the L. And to all my participants who are attending the webinar, I just want to introduce myself with one of the top ranking professor in the area of marketing, and I feel so much pride to know that Neeraj has such a good connect with Professor Sudhir, and who is none other than the editor-in-chief of Marketing Science, one of the flagship journal of the Inform. And it's very difficult for people to publish paper in the marketing science. And I'm so lucky that Mr. Sudhir has kindly accepted our request. And now he's going to discuss something about a very interesting topic, that is attribute sentiment scoring with online text reviews. And before I go formal introduction about him, I say once again, sir, so you are so kind enough to come to our campus and particularly online platform. So Professor Sudhir is a James C. L. Frank Professor of Private Enterprise Management and Marketing and Director of Yale China India Insights Program at Yale University, US. His research focuses on gaining market insights by analyzing consumer and firms' action through econometric modeling. As director of China India Insights Program, he specializes in the research on consumers in emerging markets. He has consulted for Fortune 500 US firms and Indian firms across many industries, specializing in analyzing their internal data to obtain actionable market insights. He heads the various data-driven research projects at the Yale Center for Customer Insights. Professor Sudhir is currently editor-in-chief of Marketing Science, which I repeated earlier, and he previously served as senior editor at the Marketing Science and associate editor at all of the quantitative marketing leading journals, and the Journal of Marketing Research, Management Science, Marketing Science, and Quantitative Marketing and Economics. With this introduction, I once again welcome you, sir, and you can now start your presentation. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, Director Tiwari, and thank you, Neeraj, for having me on this webinar. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. And as I was telling Professor Tiwari, NITIE is obviously always a top-ranked institution. It was a place I wanted to go to when I was thinking about my master's degree. And so it's good to finally be able to give a talk at NITIE after many, many, many years. So as you can see, the title of this talk is Professor Tiwari just mentioned, is attribute sentiment scoring with online text reviews. And it's a long title. There are three things that are highlighted, and I will talk about each of these so that you will have a clear idea of what the title means. But before I do that, let me kind of to tell you a little bit of the outline, which is first to talk about the journal itself. As was mentioned, I am the editor-in-chief at Marketing Science, the flagship Informs journal on quantitative marketing. So I wanted to give you a sense of the review process. I'll take about 10 to 15 minutes to talk about that. And then what I will do is to talk about this particular paper for about 35 to 40 minutes, and then leave some time for Q&A at the end. Okay, so with that as a plan, let's start with Marketing Science. As Mr. Tiwari mentioned, the Marketing Science is the premier quantitative journal in marketing. Its reputation comes from its authors and from its top associate editors and reviewers. We welcome a diverse set of methods and topics, anything that is related to quantitative marketing. And I will briefly kind of give you some insights about what we mean by the quality and diversity of our authorship. So ultimately, the strength of a journal comes from its papers, and the strength of its papers comes from its authors. So we are very, very delighted to have the...
It's a very interesting cycle.
So ultimately, it's about the authors. So, for now, I will start by saying, if you look at the top 20 business schools ranked by any 100% of them publish in marketing science, right? So that's every year, everyone seeks this. This is what gets you tenure at top journals and at top schools and so on. So clearly, it's a place where top people publish. But what I like to emphasize for this talk is the second part, the diversity of authors that we have. Every year, we count the number of new institutions that publish in marketing science. And if you look at that, there are about 15 to 20 schools that get represented. So it's not a closed community for only people who are friends of each other, but actually it's something that we are welcoming, people from other places. Now, these new institutions tend to be mostly right now from Europe and China and Australia. Right? So we don't have a lot of Indian representation, but that's what we want to fix over the next few years. And we'd like to see top people from India publishing in marketing science. And I'm hoping the conversations that we have today inspires and gets people to think about what it is to take to the next level. So I'll very briefly go a little bit through the journey process. It's not hugely different from any other journal, so I will not spend too much time on it. But let me give you a quick overview, and then we'll talk a little bit about what it would take for us to publish at marketing. So what it would take for Indian authors to publish in marketing science. So the journey is relatively simple, right? So as the EIC, the editor-in-chief, I get the paper when you submit it initially through Manuscript Central. So everyone submits initially through Manuscript Central, which is like the online review platform. You can suggest who your SC, the senior editor, should be, the AE, and the reviewers are. I get the paper, I look at it and decide whether this paper should even go into the review process. And many papers don't. Sometimes, many papers from India might come saying determinants of microwave buying behavior in Calcutta. That's not particularly greatly interesting for a whole bunch of people, or the contributions may not be very clear. So we might decide this is not worth reviewer time, so we might reject that paper. But if I don't, then I will assign a senior editor for the journal, who in turn will assign the AE and the reviewers. The thing about marketing science is that the senior editors have all of the power. As editor-in-chief, I am one of the 6 senior editors. And so once I assign it to 6 people, they handle the process from then on, which is very good for authors, because you now not only are dependent on just my taste, but also, you can choose if there are other people who you think would be more aligned with the kinds of ideas that you have and might see some positive things. You might suggest them, and I would try to match you with the senior editor who is most likely to be most supportive of your paper. The associate editor can then recommend reviewers. So the paper goes to an associate editor. He is kind of the he or she is kind of the expert in the area, and can suggest reviewers, and the senior editor will assign them, and then will write a report based on what they get from the review team. So the review team will evaluate for contribution, will certify the correctness of the paper, and then give you feedback on how to improve the paper if they decide we want to move forward. The one highlight I want to mention is we have only 2 reviewers, not 3, which is tremendous. If you ever have tried to write a reviewer response and so on to the reviewers, you don't want that proverbial 3rd reviewer who's always trying to add more and more things that you have to do. 2 reviewers are good enough to be able to give good feedback, and then along with the associate editor, you get pretty good comprehensive feedback. And one of the things that you will always hear about marketing science editorial quality is that even people getting rejected will come back and tell you, you rejected us, I was sad about it, but I did learn a lot from the review process. The quality of the reviewers generally tend to be very high and lower variability than at many other journals. So outcomes. Desk reject, I probably reject about 20% of the papers before sending it out for review. Among the papers that get sent out, about 80% of them do get rejections. Only about 20% of them survive the process. And then once you've survived the first round, your chances are 80%. You only have a 20% chance of rejection. So mostly, most are able to do what we ask them to do. Otherwise, we don't even give them the chance to get a review. And the way we do this is we try to be very clear in the first round, right? And so the reason we don't reject it after the first round is that when we are in the first round, we tell you very clearly, we have a high bar for crossing, but once you cross that bar, we will allow you to publish. And we will be consistent across time. We won't change the rules on you after after the first round or the second round. Now, you got to be responsive to high priority items. One of the things that happens is people, if somebody writes 3 pages of reviews, the reviewer, they respond to 2.5 pages of it, which is all the small things, but not worry about the half page, which is really the most important stuff. So you got to be responsive to the high priority items. That's what we would be looking for. And if there are things that you are not able to do, or if it's too onerous and you think the reviewers didn't fully appreciate, you can check with the SC, and the SC will get back to the reviewers and make sure that we will say, yeah, you could probably not do that, and we could still publish the paper, right? So that kind of clarification, relatively rare. People don't come to us very often for that, but if they do, we're happy to give that feedback. Now, let me quickly, talk about what it is that you need to publish in the journal. This is, true for most journals, but probably not everyone clear about what exactly they are looking for and why they are rejecting or accepting papers, right? So one way to think about it is the 3 C's. Any of you in marketing knows that marketers love their 3 C's and 4 P's and all of that stuff. But I have what I call the 3 C's of the marketing science review process. It's about contribution, right? Correctness and clarity. So let me kind of explain what that is, right? If you're going to write a paper, very clearly upfront, you should know what is going to be your incremental contribution over and above what we already know, right? You can't just do a consulting project where some company or something where, everything that has been done by other people. You're just doing it once more, right? That doesn't do. What is novel about your work? It can be in terms of findings. I discovered something that is new and generalizable that people didn't know before, or I introduced a new model that allows us to kind of learn about and model things differently, or I came up with a new method that would be useful for a whole bunch of people. It has to contribute at least in one of these dimensions: findings, method, or model, right? If you don't have that, if you cannot very early on in your abstract and in your introduction say, this is what is new about our paper, and we can then assess whether that newness is good enough for marketing science, the paper will get rejected, right? So you've got to be able to articulate and then think for yourself whether it's big enough. Now, you can make that contribution claim, but then what we have to do is to assess whether you're correct. Right? Anybody can go and write in a magazine and claim a bunch of things. But what a good journal does is to certify the correctness of what you are claiming. So do you have the right data? Do you have the right empirical strategy to identify and claim the results that you have? Do you use the correct analysis and methods? And so we, as publishing in the journal, approval that the paper is correct in the claims that it makes. So first, you got to have the claims. Second, you got to be correct about it. And third is clarity. Ultimately, we want our readers to read, understand, and implement these things and change the world. And if you're going to do that, the paper has to be clear about what it is that it is saying. The exposition has to be clear. In fact, a lot of authors think that we can make things a little bit more complicated, use a lot of jargon, and somehow people are going to be more impressed by that. That's not true. It's the clearest papers are the ones that make its point in the simplest possible way. You don't need a lot of pretty math unnecessarily. The math should be what is needed to get the points across, not because you want to beautify and prettify and make it look fancy, right? And so that's the 3 things, right? So contribution, certification of, so first you got to make a claim, then you got to certify that it's correct, and then it has to be written clearly that people can understand what you wrote, right? So it's very simple. It's not very complicated. And most papers, I think, are rejected on contribution grounds. We just simply say, look, your contribution is not big enough for us to publish in marketing science. You might take it to another journal with less contribution threshold, right? Or we have our own very high standards for correctness. If you make a claim that we think is not really dotted and crossed, then we would say, look, the correctness is not good enough, and we would reject. But papers often get rejected because of contribution. And I like to joke and jest, which C is not needed? Complexity. Just because it's marketing science, you don't need a lot of math and complexity. That's not what we're looking for, right? So I hope this is memorable. Start with the contribution before you start writing the paper, right? And think very hard before submitting, do you have a contribution? Okay, so with that, let me move on. Very briefly talk about how you should respond to a reviewer when you get a revise and resubmit, right? First, take the big picture changes that you've made so that every reviewer can say, oh, these guys really took it to their time and really made the big changes that was necessary to publish the paper. Then make it easy on the reviewers and the review team by taking each of the reviewers' comments, copying them, and say, this is how we are responding to your comments. So they can, a good review response means that people don't even have to go back to the paper. They may go to check if you said you did everything you did, but they can read the review response and immediately say, oh, the people have figured out what the problem is and they have solved it, right? From a mindset point of view, remember that the reviewers are volunteering their time. Nobody is this is not helping their career. They're doing this in secret. Hardly anybody gets credit. So start with a thank you. And the reason I say start with a thank you is that it brings in the right mindset because you feel grateful rather than, hey, these guys are preventing me from publishing, I'm upset with them, right? So start with that thank you and then respond to everything in a very professional way, not being angry. I have to say that having published all these papers over all these years, I still get very angry when I see some reviewers telling me everything I did was wrong. I spent 3 years writing that paper and they tell me everything I did was wrong. I get angry, but don't let that anger show in your review response. So step back, take the time, and write a response which is very professional. And and the first revision is the most critical. Solve the problems. Think about what's the big picture. Now, all of this is if you get to this point, right? So we need to get to this point where you would get that revise and resubmit. So let me think a little bit. And since Director Tiwari is here, it's actually a perfect place for me to talk about this issue, right? So how can Indian scholars publish in top journals? And this is not top marketing journals, top journals across the board. You can think about and apply this idea anywhere. So I have 3 buckets here: infrastructure, training, and mentorship. But let me start with mentorship, okay? Because young scholars, PhD students, assistant professors seeking out, this is kind of very important. Even as I tell you all this stuff, I know that this is pretty hard. Right? It's a hard job to publish. If it were easy, we would all be having this job and we'd all be getting well paid for doing really easy stuff. It's hard stuff. So it's hard stuff. And so what is one of the pieces of advice I have is seek out scholars with some experience publishing in these journals. So if you have people who can help you or mentor you, that goes a long way in navigating the process. That's why you need advisors, that's why you need it. But in this case, you may not have advisors in India, but reach out to people who have already published in other places, right? But why would they spend time with you? Because they're all very busy people, right? So you might want to think about what's in it for them. In some ways, what can you bring to the party? Can you bring some novel data, some field experimental that you can do with a company? Relationships and tell the potential mentor, look, I have all these connections, I have these resources, we can probably work together, I can bring this to the table, and maybe that'll cause them to want to work with you, right? And this is exactly the model the Chinese and European scholars who are newly publishing have all done, right? What they do is they bring in European data or they bring in European company relationships, and the Chinese are very generous with giving you data, right? And then you work together to produce new knowledge with the experience of people who already know how to do that, and then you become independent over time. The Chinese are now very successful. So this is what I would suggest thinking a little bit. Now, you might say, well, I'm a junior scholar or a PhD student. Who's going to give me data? Who's going to give me relationships? And this is where I suggest, Indian schools can think a little bit more strategically in terms of thinking about infrastructure. This is a place where directors and deans can support experimentation platforms with companies, partnerships. So instead of going to your alumni and saying, fund one more chaired professorship or something like that, which is of course very valuable and important, you could also ask, hey, you guys are in top positions. We would also like to be the leaders in research. We just know that the Prime Minister of India has launched this initiative to make India the leading research center of the world. And and he's organizing a panel starting on October 2nd for the month, getting all professors from all around the world to talk about how India can be a leading center. Now, I think the way to do it is actually internally going to Indian companies and talking about, help us do this research. We can add value. We are the best people in India, right? Thinking about these questions. How do you work together with us in order to be able to create that? And while senior faculty can often do that, it might also be best if you can make this kind of a platform accessible to all faculty and all students. This becomes a resource. And imagine if you did that, you would actually win the competition to win faculty. Because if you had these kinds of resources, smart faculty would want to come to your institution, right? So this is the kind of competition that the Chinese do, right? They build this kind of infrastructure, give it to all their faculty, and then other faculty want to join there because they have this infrastructure, which makes them productive researchers. So this is, to me, a very important thing, and this might be easier for the senior faculty and for the administration to do more than young and PhD students. And the second part of it is training, which is exactly the kind of things that Professor Tiwari and Neeraj, etc., are trying. Try to get good people to come and talk and teach people, right? Focus training. And I would say start with things that are a little bit more manageable and easy to do, right? Behavioral work with experiments. There is a behavioral lab that can be set up relatively, with some money, but it can be done. Or try to use quasi-experimental field experiment methods where the training levels are not as high, perhaps, as writing some fancy structural econometric modeling and things like that. And so maybe there is a way to walk before you run by picking on areas and topics where bringing in novel data, relationships, etc., would leverage you to be successful. Create a consortium across Indian schools for doctoral training, just like what you guys are doing now, right? Have a webinar, but keep it open for everyone. Have some courses, all the IITs and NITIE together, run some programs where you come and get training for doctoral students. And just for raw ideas, I would say keep an advisory board of a very few active scholars across various disciplines and think about how the institution can support research and really put your money where your mouth is. So these are some ideas. I think the number 3 is the mentoring idea for the young students, and young assistant professors. But the other 2, I think you should take to your administration and try to see how they can support you with this. Okay, so that's my spin on how we can make India the leading research center or a leading research center in the world, right? And with that, I will stop for a minute, take any comments or thoughts, and then before I get into the paper itself. Okay, so do I see any questions on the chat board? I need your views on LinkedIn profile data. Do you consider? Sure, yeah, why not? Those are good data if you can get them, and if you can harvest them in some useful ways. Yes, it could be very interesting to study social networks. It would be very interesting to see who gets jobs. There are all kinds of personal marketing issues that you could do. Yeah, it's great data. So yes, okay. So let's move on and talk about the paper itself. Okay. So as there are, first, I need to mention that Ishita Chakravarti, actually, she is here on the webinar from Yale, is a doctoral student. She is a 5th-year doctoral student. She's on the job market. Unfortunately, because of COVID, there are not too many schools hiring this year, but if there were, many of them would want her, right? She's the brains and the brawn behind a lot of what I'm going to talk about. So I want to make sure that she is assigned the credit. She is the first author on this paper. And Minkyung Kim is a doctoral student of a former doctoral student of ours who's currently an assistant professor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and she's done some fabulous work on a variety of areas, and she is one of our co-authors on this paper. And so there are 3 top things in bold: attribute sentiment scoring. So I'll talk about what that is. And I'll talk about the second word, language structure, and attribute silence. And so by the time our initial introduction is over, you'll know exactly what the title means and maybe a lot of what the paper means. Okay. So before I get to this specific paper, I would say that this research agenda around unstructured text data is part of a broader agenda for us in thinking about unstructured data, text, images, audio, video, right? People estimate that 80% of the data in the world is hidden because they're unstructured. They're under the ocean, so to speak. You don't see them because most managers don't know how to even convert them into useful insight. Right? And so what is the opportunity with machine learning and natural language processing and computer vision and all of that is that these data are now coming to life, and we can use this for managerial insight. And so today's paper, think of it as part of that broad portfolio. And we're doing a bunch of other work around these kinds of issues, but this is an illustration of what you can do when you bring in new data, text data, etc., which is not normally usable because it's not in Excel spreadsheets or databases that you can easily analyze, right? So that's the big picture agenda. Now, very specifically, what do I mean by attribute sentiment scoring? That was the first word, and that's the main problem of the paper. So suppose you go to Yelp and you see a review like this, and you say, well, I read the review, that's fine. But how nice would it be if somebody told me on food, the score is a 5, on service, the score is a 3 or whatever, right? So if you can just find, convert this text data into scores like that, that would be wonderful. So in this case, food, appetizer, okay, and standard, but the salmon was great. So food is okay is a 3, let us say, an average, great is a 5, so the average is 4, right? So that's what the score 4 for food is. And you can do this for service, you can do this for price. I can do it sentence by sentence and come up with, what's the average scores on food, service, price. Now, one thing you notice, they don't write about location, they don't write about ambience, right? So they don't write about this. So what you want as a manager or even as a consumer looking at Yelp is to look at how we can convert this kind of text data into numbers, right? If we can do that, that would be useful value, right? So this is an example of converting unstructured data to useful text data. Now, there are two parts to this problem. One is converting unstructured text data to structured data. Now, to be sure, lots of people have done textual analytics, and somebody on the chat said, Ajit said, oh, I've used Python and LTK techniques to perform text analytics. So that's really good, right? Many people have done that. And so we're going to tell you why a lot of work that has been done so far may be inadequate, and we might need better, more advanced work on building and doing things. So that's kind of the big picture view. The second part is once you've got the data, it doesn't mean that just because you're doing machine learning, all the other problems that we used to have with converting and making sense of the data from an econometrics approach actually goes away, right? So what we have is two parts to this problem. A second part is that a lot of people don't write. If you choose to write, I saw it that way thing, somebody wrote about food, somebody wrote about service, somebody wrote about location, but they didn't write about ambience or price or value or something like that. What does that mean? So when people are silent about an attribute silence, how do you fill that in? Does that mean it's an average 3? Does it mean it was high? It was very satisfactory? Does it mean it was unsatisfactory? So basically you have two problems. One is language structure, and I'll explain what language structure means. And the second is that what do you infer when people don't write about it? So these are two problems in doing this problem. Even though text analytics has been done a lot, it's a problem. So as I said, to be sure, many people have done text analytics work. And a lot of these standard packages that you see today actually use what are called bags of words models. They basically count the frequency with which different types of words are used and then make interpretations. So you might hear fancy terminology like LDA, latent Dirichlet allocation, topic models, or somebody would say lexicon-based methods. There's lots of different things, and people do, and people have written lots of papers. But essentially, all of these papers basically count the number of words and then and think of a document as a bag of words. Now, my joke is that, if I give the same bag of words to Shakespeare and to me, Shakespeare would produce a far more interesting essay out of it than I would be able to, right? So clearly, the way we use and structure words matter when it comes to text analytics. But most of the work today that we do are not taking into account that language structure. So without language structure, some simple sentences you could do well. The pizza was good. Of course, I can make sense out of it. The waiter was mean. Yeah, I can make sense. So everywhere in this presentation, if you see green, it means good. If you see red, it means bad. Okay, so that's the color coding we are going to use. And darker the green, better. Darker the red, worse. Okay, so just keep that in the back of your mind as you look at the color coding in the presentation. But 48% of our sentences in our application are now these simple, easy sentences. And I'm going to explain what that means, right? And some people have started using deep learning in marketing and use fancier techniques. But when it comes to text, they've not really thought about language structure. So that's where I'm going to go with. So, okay, I want everybody's attention at this point, right? So what do I mean by language structure and why do we need to worry about all this? Okay, so think about if you were to just count words, how would the first sentence be? Pizza was good, okay? Then pizza was not that good. Pizza was not at all good. And you can see how the gradation from, a 4 on pizza was good, not that good to a 3, and not at all good is probably a 1, right? But how does one, if one doesn't think through the words together, and that's grouping of words, you're never going to make the right inference. So thinking just as independent bag of words will not get us there, right? Delight just missed being a delight. That has to be thought together, right? And that is what I would call as the spatial structure of language, the grouping of sentences together into phrases. So you've got to think about groups of words, not bag of words, okay? Then let's think about contrastive and long sentences, especially the ones with but, instead of, despite, all that kind of stuff. The menu was creative, but the execution was a disappointment. Now, the first part looks like it was good, but the second part says it wasn't very good. Okay, so here's a very long sentence. Okay, that's kind of average. In fact, good to start with, right? So you got to put that together and say, well, that seems above average, but kept getting worse. And the wait staff were unapologetic. But, and think about that but, and it changes everything. Managers saved the night, right? There is this twists and turns that happen when people write sentences. And you've got to be able to get to the end point of that thing. And that's what I mean by language structure. And so what we do with our deep learning approach to account for language structure is first start with a convolutional layer that is part of a convolutional neural network, right, to capture these groupings of words. And then we do what is called a long short-term memory module to handle the sequential structure of language, right? A long and a short-term memory is what it means is that I think about immediately what I'm saying, that is the short-term memory, then I think about what was said in the past, then I connect it and think about what's the net meaning of what I am presenting, okay? So I'm not going to go to all the math today here, but I want you to get a sense of this so that if you're interested in research, you will go and pursue this a little bit more. And of course, our paper is available as well. So now to the second part. So everyone clear with me? The first part is essentially about accounting for language structure. And basically what we're saying is existing methods have not done a great job, at least in marketing. And then even in computer science, this is really a very active area of research. It attributes silence in reviews. Heterogeneous, so people have different motivations for why they want to write and be silent. So a lot of literature says, well, people write about what is important to them, right? And in fact, this method is, this idea used to say, reviewers and all the things that people are complaining about to learn what it is that we need to offer for new products and topics. So importance is something that a lot of people think is driving what people write about. A second kind of issue is I write because I want to inform other people. I want to see what people would want to know, what they may not know, and what they would learn by reading my review, informativeness. Now, and the third kind of argument is that I just like to praise or vent and speak out stuff. And I don't want to just say, oh, well, everything is fine or average. But I really, when I say things that excite me to say good or bad, I would like to praise or vent, right? So what is it that is driving reviews? And our goal is to develop a model of rating behavior so that we can use this model to predict what would have been the score in this setting when you don't see somebody writing an attribute. So that's the second part. How do we fill in when people don't write about an attribute by thinking about the structure of the review and the characteristics of the restaurant and the person? So here's the contribution, right? I'm going to just lay this out. So what we do in the computer science, natural language processing part, NLP part, is to convert unstructured data by really thinking about the structure of language. And on the econometric side, we develop a model of heterogeneous rating behavior, which gives us insights on why people write and how to impute when people do not write. Okay? So I wanted to share this with you. I told you I was at IIT in industrial engineering. And when I was there, I wrote a paper as part of my master's thesis. And when I wrote this, the thing in orange that I have marked, it says when I published it back in 92, my current research is in the areas of AI applications and AI evolved. Unfortunately, when I came to the US and AI was still in its fledgling and it wasn't really that great, and I became more of an econometrician. And it's kind of interesting, after 28 years, I get a chance to now live my AI dreams as well as combine it with econometrics. So just wanted to say, if you have a dream, it'll probably come through at some point, never live the dream, right? Okay, so yeah, so this is our data set, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time. This comes from the Yelp challenge. It's available to all of you. Anybody can take this data set from the public domain, okay? It's not really one of those my company relationships that I got, right? So this is public domain data. You can all do this. So what we do is we have a certain set of reviews where businesses that have at least had 10 reviews, so that we can learn something about that business, and then reviewers who have at least done a few reviews, right? We keep them, and this is the set of people, and we try to balance them based on whether you have chains and restaurants, elite reviewers versus non-elite reviewers. We try to balance and make sure that we capture a representative sample, a representative stratified sample of reviews that cover all the observables we'd like. Okay, so that I won't belabor this. You can read the paper if you want to. So what are the challenges? So the first part is the text analytics part, right? Just for those of you who may want to have a little bit of a history here, right? The old methods used to be what are called dictionary methods, right? So you would create a dictionary of your own about what is the food words, what are service words, what are ambience words, and then you would think about what are positive words, what are negative words, right? And then you would try to match and count, which is exactly the kind of thing that I did. So from the 70s onwards, people have been doing. So this is not new at all. Right? This is so even though some of us have been doing it in the last 10 years, this has been an idea that has been there for a long time. It's very simple, it's easy to interpret. I could show you that picture and you all understood what I was trying to do when I showed you that initial review. Now, the problem was it's not scalable. It's very hard. You got to keep, creating these dictionaries and it's not very accurate because, as I said, bag of words don't work that well, right? Then there are in the last, 15 years or so, machine learning, support vector machine, etc., became very popular, logistic regression. So they were trying to say, let's not, use these dictionaries and construct things. Let's use prediction and just send the words in and let's predict based on what we have in terms of training data, whether something is positive or not. So machine learning was more scalable, more accurate. But what you still realized was it wasn't good enough for accuracy because it wasn't really capturing the structure of these languages and things like that. And then we got, because of the advances in computer vision, right, that translated into natural language processing as well. And I'll explain why it became. But since 2013, natural language processing has had a really big advance because of deep learning. And I'll explain to you a little bit about why that happened starting 2013, okay? But today we have much more scalability, much more accuracy, but it's a little bit harder because it's the deep learning model is hard to understand. And say, this is why I classified this guy as positive or negative, right? You have to work backwards and reverse engineer and say, does it make sense? So it's a different kind of an approach, but this is where we are all going with. Now, there are 4 layers in our model. It's not very different from any other model. So any of you who built a logistic regression probably has done some simple version of this, okay? So I'll tell you, you start with the layer 1, which is what is called an embedding layer. But essentially what it means is I want to convert text data into numbers and send in numbers that are meaningful as input into the model. The output is very simple, right? The classifier number 4 is very simple. What it is basically saying is, look, I want you to tell me it's a food attribute or a service attribute. I want you to classify like a logit model, or I want you to classify it into one of 4 types. Or I want to classify it as a positive or a negative sentiment. So I want you to classify. So input goes as numbers, output comes as a classifier. So this part is fun. In between 2 and 3, this is the deep learning model. So those of you who might have written a logistic regression, what you've done in between is put a logit model in between. But what I'm going to put in is this layer that captures a spatial structure and a layer that captures sequential structures. So the point is, this is not so fancy and so different from anything you've learned, right? Everybody sends in some inputs and gets an output. And in between what you do could be a logit model, but in this case, we have a more fancy convolutional module and an LSTM module. So what is this supposed to be? I will take, let's see, how am I doing on time? Okay, so given in the interest of time, let me not talk more about this and let me get to the, so the only point I want to make is that, if you take words, words are represented like numbers like this. So here there are 5 vectors, right? 5 dimensions of words, and you're going to represent them. And that's good. And how did these 5 numbers come, right? That's where word2vec and GloVe, 2 techniques, again, this is publicly accessible. If after this, if you're interested, you can go and download things in Python, etc. It's very easy to do these things. And the main idea is that words that are similar will have similar numbers, okay? So this is good to, easy to do. And think about the advantage of doing it this way. Suppose I had 9 words like this: man, woman, boy, girl, etc. In the old days, when we were using purely support vector machine, the way you would do is every word would get its own dummy variable, right? And you would code it as a 1. So if you had 9 words, you would have 9 variables. That's too much. If you had 1,000,000 words, then I would have 1,000,000 variables, right? So that's too much. So can we reduce this into something here? So in the right side, I have 3 variables. Let us call it femininity, youth, and royalty. So woman would be a 1 on feminine, a princess would be 1 on youth, a princess would be also 1 on feminine, and would be 1 on royalty, and so on. So now I've reduced this data to 3 variables. And so this is very familiar for those of us who know factor analysis or principal competence analysis. You reduce a large data into something smaller. And that's exactly what word2vec and GloVe did, but it was the ability to convert numbers at scale like that essentially allowed us to use the computer vision techniques for natural language processing, because now you could send this as numbers into the system, okay? So that's the first step, and I want you to kind of recognize that. And what you see, as I pointed out, if you did that, words like tasty, their similarity with food is much higher than with everything else. Stylish goes very much with ambience. So all the things that in yellow you see, those are the places where you get the big numbers, and the other off-diagonal numbers are very small, which is exactly the promise that these representations of numbers actually make sense. Now, this part is not new at all, so I don't want you to, but I do think for those of you who don't know, this might be useful to know, okay? Now, think back to that sentence that I talked about. Okay, in fact, good. Right? So I want this in fact good to be thought about together, or to start with, etc., to be thought together. That's the spatial structure. And then as you go through, you're saying, oh, well, they said it was good, but kept getting worse. So now I have to think in the short run, they were saying good, but as you get to kept getting worse, you have to have your long-term memory. What were they saying in the past before? It was all good, but the but is now changing the sentiment. It's saying, okay, well, it's getting worse. And it's adding wait stuff are unapologetic, and so it's getting worse and unapologetic, and so yeah, it was good at the beginning, but really things got bad. So at the end, it was very bad. That's what you've stored in your long-term memory as you think, but manager saved the night, right? And so you're now completely reversing it based on this new piece of information. So this kind of sequential and spatial structure together is what the CNN LSTM approach is going to capture. Clearly, I don't have time to tell you all the math involved, but keep this in the back of your mind as you're going to read those papers elsewhere, okay? So what's the point of all of this, right? So once you do this, right, on attributes, you don't make a whole lot of sense. Attributes are relatively easy to code. So 68%, we move up to 71%. But where do we do well? On the sentiment scoring. On the 5-level sentiment scoring, if you act very dumb and put everybody into one group, or if you just use a random number generator, you'll get about 20% correctness. Lexicon moves it from 20 to 31%. Our model takes it from 20 to 50%. So that's a 250% improvement over a dumb approach, okay? And it's quite a lot compared to lexicon and other methods. And so that's what we did. But not only that, we doubled our performance compared to the bag of words models. The 18% that you found and the 20% that you found with support vector machine and machine learning, all that was only 20%. With our deep learning model, we were able to raise that to 36%. And this is what I was saying, that for hard sentences, without thinking about language structure, you're not going to do that. Now, 36%, you might say, well, that's not good enough. Like, I'd like to be better. But actually, this is pretty good compared to the art and computer science. So another way to think about it is if you looked at only positive, negative, and neutral, right? Just the valence, like, I want to look at what is positive, what is negative, and neutral. Then we get about 70% accuracy. And that's as good as the state of the art, right? There is this website called, which talks about, what is the state of the art, and you'll find that this is actually quite good. So what we've done is not only done well overall accuracy, but we've really done well on hard sentences. And, you may feel dissatisfied with it. I would encourage you to then say, look, we want to do even better. But now we're giving you some metrics to say 36% is the current benchmark. Let's kind of move on and build more about it. Okay? So with all that said, so let us say we converted text into numbers, right? And now I want to think about, okay, well, how do I come up with an average score for a restaurant? Or if I am a Marriott and decide, Marriott has been talking to us and saying, we would like to come up with a rating score for all our chains, right? Based on review data, so that on a monthly basis, we get metrics, and then we use this for various kinds of performance evaluation. Now, here is the problem with that. Right. The problem is that many people don't write in reviews. So, so some reviews you do not write. You may not find about food. You may not find about location. So what we want to do is to think about what are the motivations of different reviewers, and how are they strict reviewers? Are they tough reviewers? What is it that they want to communicate? We want to build a model of rating behavior so that we can predict, depending on who and what restaurant, what would they have written? And then we want to adjust the observed scores with this imputation that we provide in order to be able to experience. So I'm going to do this relatively quickly, but I just want to get you the intuition, okay? So here's the model. Every one of us who goes into a restaurant, the restaurant doesn't know it's you or me, right? They're going to show one base level of service. So each of us would get one latent utility, the latent utility aijk star. I don't observe it, but utility is going to be the same for all of us, subject to a shock, this extreme value shock. Okay. Now, so this part I can see which restaurants will give me high ratings and which restaurants will be high utility and better experience. But the second part is the tough part. Now, if you and I got the same experience, it doesn't necessarily mean that you and I would give the same rating. Okay? Now look at this. There is this orange guy, reviewer 1, and a blue guy, reviewer 2. So for the same latent utility, right, the blue guy is a tougher guy. He demands more before giving you a 2 or a 3 or a 4 or a 5, right? He's a tougher reviewer. And you could also do this based on that there are different types of reviewers, and there are also elite reviewers based on observers and unobservables. People can be different. And that's what this model is supposed to capture for us, that the mapping from aijk star, can you guys see what I'm pointing out? Just say yes on the chat if you can see where I'm pointing my mouse. aijk star, and aijk, the mapping from the experienced utility to actual ratings can be different for different people. As I showed you in that picture, the thresholds can be different. And those thresholds can be different not only by observers, like is this an elite reviewer or a non-elite reviewer, but also based on unobservers. So we're going to put people into different buckets and segments, and we're going to say different people are going to behave differently. And then we also have the RIJ, the ratings. This is the overall rating. Every Yelp review will have an overall rating, and we're going to say, well, that's going to be a weighted sum of all the attribute ratings. And then we're going to estimate this model using what is called an EM algorithm, and I won't go through all of those in detail. Okay, so you should feel free to look it up, those of us who are interested in research on this. So what are some insights? So here are the insights from the model. That there are 3 segments. One is typically what we think of the elite reviewers who write elaborate reviews, long reviews, then they write about all kinds of attributes. They're about 10% of the market. And 65% of these are elites. These are the people who are using Yelp to generate some kind of status, get invited to Yelp parties, and so on, right? So they want to do stuff that gets them attention and prestige. Then there is the segment 3, which is the opposite. There are no elites in these guys. These guys typically come late to the party after everybody else has reviewed the restaurant, and then they write very few and short reviews. But their key thing is that they will very quickly either praise you or vent about what they didn't like or what they liked. And these are what we call the emotive irregulars, right? They come in infrequently and they do this. But the mass, the 6% of the reviewers are doing it because they feel like they have to give back to the community, or they want to have a voice and being heard and so on. So they write reasonably moderate-sized reviews. They mention a few more attributes than the irregulars, but less than the status seekers and so on. Okay, so this is what we see, and this is unobserved, right? So I don't observe it. The model helps me estimate that there are these 3 types of people. Now, with very different behaviors. So when I impute for the segment 1, right, I would have to do a different imputation than for segment 2 than for segment 3. Right? Also, of course, based on the characteristics of the restaurants and their other observable characteristics, like whether they are elites, etc. Right? So there is a bunch of things, and I can do a rich imputation with this model. That's what we do. And so you might wonder, okay, well, how do you know that the model works in fitting it? And it turns out, and you can see that our method, the orange numbers, are almost always on our method. We do better than a model with no heterogeneity, where there's only one segment, or some ad hoc imputations where people would say, let's give an average score whenever we don't know that's a score of 3, and so on. And the only place where we are a little behind is on location. And that's the reason is that very few people write about location. So when you have no data at all, then putting in the average may be a reasonable thing, then, because our model cannot pick up that much fine tuning, right? So we don't have all of that. Okay, so we talked about drivers of attribute silence. So when I started, when we started this project, we had been looking at all these papers which talk about attribute importances and said, look, we can now learn from the reviews, what do people care about? So if what do people care about is important, then meaning we should see correlations between what gets written is important to them. But what we find in the estimation and the model is that what people find important is not what they write about. So that is actually causing us to rethink how to think about UGC, because it's not necessary that what is important is all people are writing about. But what we find in contrast is informativeness. People think a lot about what is it that people really care. So if you think about a restaurant, you can know about the price by just looking at the Yelp. They will have a $2 or $3 signs, right, which tells you it's an expensive restaurant or a less expensive restaurant. You know about the location from the address. You know a lot about the neighborhood from just looking at the address. What you don't know is, before you walk in, is the food good? Is the service good? How is the ambience? In fact, those attributes are the ones that people write about, because they feel like, that's an experience attribute, and that's what people are reading reviews for. And we found even more interesting things, right? They write more if there is variance in other people's writings. So if you say something and another person says something, the 2 people saying different opinions, then I am more eager to tell you my opinion, because there is no consensus on the current opinion. And we see that when there is variance in other people's ratings, that's when you write more. And third, they're more likely to write if you see that the average is about a 5, but according to you, the ratings were low, then you are more likely to write. Right? And so this is, again, a little bit of a need to vent. You can think about it as a vent, but it's also additional information. You think that what is there currently is not exactly the accurate information, and you want to correct it for people reading the review. And then there is the praising bar venting need, which you find more likely to praise for food, service, and ambience. And segment 3, which is the only group that actually values price and location. They basically take all the information from other people. So by the time they go to the restaurant, they know very clearly what is about food and this thing. Then they come and complain about if they don't like about price and location, right? So they're a little bit different, but there is these 2 needs are informativeness, and praising and venting is what drives and not information. And for us, this was a big surprise. When we started, we thought the first one was going to be the most important one because that's what the literature had talked about. And then we found these two are more important. And all of this hard work, does it pay off? Yes, it pays off. The black line is the continuous line. Black line is the corrected scores, but the dashed lines are the uncorrected scores. And what you find is that the dashed line varies a lot, whereas the black lines are far more stable. And that's partly because we are imputing for all those places where people didn't write about, we are making corrections. And all I want to show you is that these corrections matter. These numbers 3.2 to 2 makes a big difference. If you tell service is bad at 2 for a restaurant, that would look very bad. But if you see it's 3.2, that would be a lot better. And that's what the truth was, 3.2, not 2, because of selection. And so what we're saying is all this hard work pays off in these metrics. And that's why companies like Marriott and hotel chains are saying, we would like to implement these kinds of ideas for our own company. Okay. So to conclude, where are we, right? So we introduced this idea of 5 grains, this fine-grained sentiment scoring problem to marketing. And contrary to most of the public work that is there in text analytics, which thinks of everything as a bag of words, we argued that you really need to think about language structure. And doing that, we were able to get significant performance improvement on these difficult sentences. The second part is nobody had really talked about what does it mean when people don't write about something. And as econometricians, with my training, the training that our students have, we said, meaning computer scientists don't think about the data generating process very much, but we should be, as econometricians, we think about it. And it's an opportunity for us to combine these two areas in some interesting ways. And so we did that. And what we found is, of course, we built a new model. We learned about the segments of consumers. And the most important thing we learned about is, unlike what everybody had thought, importance is not the biggest driver of what people write, but informativeness and pricing and venting needs are. And let me conclude by saying that this is part of that rich agenda that we have in our minds about how to build management research that is at the interface of bringing together the latest in computer science methods and innovating on them, as well as econometric modeling, and what can we learn and by putting these things together. So that's where we think there are nice opportunities to improve management research. Is ultimately a social science research, right? And so computer scientists are spending a lot of time trying to understand social science data, but we, as in the management departments and economics departments, know a lot about this stuff, so we can actually add value by pulling these two together. So let me stop there, and thank you all for being a patient audience, and happy to take some questions from the chat. Please feel free to add them. Okay, so I'm going to try to see if I can expand this chat and see what the questions are. So let's see. I need your views on, I already answered LinkedIn. It's more on data. I don't understand, Rekha. Rekha, I think you said you got my answer. What are the chances of a bibliometric paper to be accepted in marketing science? I'm not sure. It depends on your research question, Mukta. And if there is some way that you can connect it to a marketing problem, sure, we would be willing to accept. Okay. Let me go back to Ajit's question. I believe that we need to create our own bag of words, and the same can be refined with the help of domain. So what you're saying is we can create our own lexicons, which is what we did, right? And my point is that it's not going to be good enough, right? Bag of words that you create, and we created our own lexicons. That's how we started. So that 18%, etc., that we showed is based on our own bag of words for our methods. And our point is that that's not going to work, Ajit. Rishabh, okay. Embeddings require tokens as input. How do we find the optimum token size? I found it challenging in one of our projects. I'm not entirely sure what you mean by that, maybe you can elaborate. I'll come back to that question. What do you mean by optimal token size? I don't understand your question, so maybe you can elaborate a little bit more about token size. Okay, so let's see. I'm an FTM student, really want your view on case validation of my findings based on machine Unfortunately, every time a new thing comes up, it pulls, it removes all the old ones. I mean, whether we need to kind of get any approval or acceptance in any, oh God, this just keeps going up. Can you guys pause typing in for a few minutes so that, and then type? Let me read the things that are there early on. So I mean whether we need any kind of approval or acceptance from any case company on such research done so that it becomes easier to publish in a journal of repute. I don't fully understand what you mean by a case validation process of my findings. But if your goal is to, meaning again, ultimately, if your storyline is very clear what the incremental contribution is, we would be happy. Some case validation, etc., are more useful in what are called our practice price papers. Or practice papers in marketing science. In others, we are not really expecting you, the company, to say that this was useful or helpful. We would be okay as long as you justified what's incrementally valuable in terms of the improved validation and things like that, and how much money you were raised. So it's not necessary, but for our practice price papers, those kinds of arguments may be helpful. So please feel free to think about our practice price papers, or not even practice papers. We have something called practice. Okay, so is there anything else? How are errors? So those details, let me kind of defer to separate or ask you to read the paper. I won't get into those, probably not broad. So can we have more categories of reviewers as the current classification seems unbalanced? So we assessed it based on how much more, based on some statistical criteria called Bayesian information criteria, which is a very standard approach to think about how many segments you want to keep. If you add more segments, it's not going to increase the predictive value. So there's a standard approach by which you would do model selection. And so here we use what is called a Bayesian information criterion to select the 3-segment model. What is the likely complexity if we plan to increase? That's related to that. So some finance topics which I can conduct research. Also attended your on page. If you can share the presentation, okay, we can talk about that later separately. Professor, I'm very interested in doing a PhD in quantitative marketing. Is it necessary to have a degree in computer science before? You don't need to have a degree in computer science. Many of our students don't, but if you do, like Ishita did, you might be able to get into a little bit more detail into the computer science nitty-gritty, but that's not necessary, or you don't need computer science at all. Any kind of engineering background with quantitative skills are good enough to do most of the things that I talked about. Given the concerns regarding privacy and ethics, how will data access be impacted in the coming years? It's a very interesting question, meaning we now have GDPR and other things. In the short run, I don't think there will be a major change. Actually, I have a paper on privacy and ethics that I've recently written. My take is that, privacy regulation is good for the industry as well as for consumers, because it creates a system of trust where in the long run we will have plenty of data, because these data are subject to strict protocols. So that's kind of a point of the paper. If you're interested, write me a note. I'd be happy to sorry, I just wanted to leave this with you there so that if you want to write me a note, I'm happy to respond. How will you account for people who did not write any reviews at all? Well, if they're not there in the data, we have nothing to say. So we are hoping that things are represented among the people who have. In fact, one of the caveats of the paper is that we may have selection issues, but that is true for all review papers. So our goal, there is nothing extra about the fact that we are looking at the attribute level sentiment. So the problems that we have will also be present in people who are not doing what we do. So we think of those as important issues, and issues of selection is something we abstract away from this paper. But great question, good point. Ishwar Gupta, so how effective is the model in detecting sarcasm? Because that's a beautiful question, meaning sarcasm and irony is one of the weakest places for this kind of text. Even our model does Better, of course, compared to other models in terms of detecting sarcasm, but irony, sarcasm, etc., are very even more difficult NLP problems. Our performance is the worst on that. Like, I didn't show you all the details there, but if you read the paper, you'll see it. And so, in fact, I think if we have an agenda around this, it is actually improving the paper on detecting sarcasm. So that's great. That's a great point. If you want to continue work on that, that would be good. What are your views about using Bayesian methods for NLP? I'm pretty agnostic to methods. I think Bayesian methods can be great. And there are lots of interesting, but underlying ideas are not very different. Whether you do Bayesian or frequentist methods, the big picture ideas are the same, how you do estimation changes. But so absolutely, if you think that you want to go Bayesian, please feel free to do that. Suggest some finance topic. Again, I heard the same thing. What are the best resources available online to get training to build these types of econometric modeling? There are lots of high level, even classes that are available these days. You can take machine learning classes that students take on Coursera and so on. So, or econometric modeling. There are lots of courses there. And I think you might also find certain professors at different universities offer some things to the public domain, in the public domain, and just go out and search for them. I have found lots of interesting entire classes from Carnegie Mellon, MIT, etc. on YouTube, and you can actually just listen and do these things. Same thing with econometric modeling. So Rajiv, a banker wants to analyze the information of a general body meeting. How would your model help? That's a very interesting question. Our problem is a lot about small text and trying to do this, but longer text and detecting of things will have to be fine-tuned for those kinds of document level analysis rather than sentence level analysis that we do. There is a lot of topic identification that is done well already, but again, if you believe that if you are kind of the belief that most of the interesting things about what is written in annual general body meetings or reports are in the footnotes, it would be very interesting to think about what do they write in the footnotes, and finance people always say, read the footnotes. That's where all the interesting stuff is. So you might want to really I would say at a very high level, obviously read the entire document, but focus on the footnotes, and maybe you might find something interesting, and that might be an interesting angle to push and pursue. Again, I don't know that literature very well to see how much incremental contribution would be there, but it's a good starting point of an idea if you're interested in that. Thank you. The study on impact of board interlocks in Indian context interests the readers. Board interlocks are often a finance problem. They're often an organizational problem. They are not centrally a marketing problem, right? But if you believe that there is a marketing outcome from that variable that would be of interest to us at the journal, yes, sure. But my first order thinking is that those kinds of questions probably affect investor issues and organizational management issues and so on. But ultimately your job is to argue that there is a marketing outcome that we care about, and that's important for marketing science. Is qualitative work encouraged in marketing science? So in our title, we said they are a quantitative journal. So purely qualitative work, no. But to the extent that this qualitative data is being converted into quantitative stuff and so on, I think we would be more interested. There are other journals in marketing that are more like JCR, which are much more attuned to qualitative work. As a methodology, do you think econometrics and machine learning technology are going to work more like being cooperative rather than competing? I don't think any of us should be thinking of anything as competing. We all take the tools that are best for the particular problem and try to do the best we can. So if there is any sense of competition, I think it's mostly people being short-sighted about it. My sense is that, econometricians are very interested in adapting machine learning techniques into their models and vice versa. So computer scientists are understanding that a lot of what they do is prediction and correlations, and it doesn't deal with causality, which econometricians are clearly very, very good at. So they want to, causal machine learning has become a big deal. So computer scientists are trying to learn that from economists. And in contrast, economists are thinking about what can we learn from all the great stuff that is happening in machine learning? How do we integrate them into ideas that we know? So leading edge work is actually coming through by both groups trying to incorporate the best ideas from each other. So it's very much cooperative, and that's what we would like as academics to be, right? Those who have blue is how can they admit? That's a difficult question to answer, maybe more privately later. Great session. Thank you to panelists. Okay, very good. So can brand equity of categories be measured using this model? That's a question from Dimple Call. Absolutely, meaning you can think about brand equity in various conversations that is happening. You could look at it from text. You can look at it through images that are there on Pinterest or Instagram about brands. And you can think about what is consumer-driven brand equity as opposed to firm-driven brand equity based on what firms are presenting as opposed to what consumers are presenting. Lots of exciting work to be done there, Dimple. If you're interested in that, go for it. Kalpak, should restaurants move their focus? Okay, so that's a more private question. Okay, I think I have tried to answer all of those questions. I know I did it relatively fast, but I hope you found it, at least most of it, useful. So I think if there are no further questions, let me call it a day. Niraj, is that good?
Yeah. Actually, Professor, it was very interesting lecture, and many things we come to know, particularly that how you are applying the different concepts of this machine learning and AI, not today, but even during your student days. So, and very few persons are knowing it. So I can say that you have the flavor to apply all this what you call tools right from the your student days. That's very good enough. And sir, these topics are very now interesting because we want to boot and automate many things, particularly when the text is there and text analytics, the part of this, and you are very nicely correlated with the marketing features. So in that count, I think it's one of the well, you can say taken presentation. And moreover, sir, we are so thankful to you that so busy schedule you are having, and despite that, you given us time to come to this platform, and a lot of students, research scholars, and faculty members, they got benefit out of your presentation, and we are also keeping whole presentation into our website so that those who miss because of exam and other things, any other online engagements, they can also take benefit out of that. So really, sir, so nice of you for us that you are you decided actually to help us by coming to this platform, and we keep on contacting you time and again, sir, so that you can think of helping us in many other ways also. So now, Neeraj, you can say something, please.
So thank you, Sudhir. It was an exciting talk, and I can see from a lot of questions coming. So definitely a great talk, and we are really grateful. It was very, very nice and insightful, and we look forward to being connected and take the journey forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It was my pleasure and honor, and really appreciate the opportunity to share my work as well as being able to be helpful in any way I can be. It's always a joy to see Indian scholars succeed and do well, and schools like NITIE, come on to doing great research. So this is a labor of love. So I'm very, very happy to be able to do this, and thank you guys. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor. See you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.